When Ichigo is trying to unlock the final Getsuga Tensho, Zangetsu adamantly opposes him. To use the attack would make him lose his powers forever, and Zangetsu understands better than Ichigo that although his desire to protect everyone is what's pushing him to do this, that same desire would go unfulfilled the rest of his life if he chooses to follow through. Zangetsu, as Ichigo's other half, knows that without power, Ichigo won't be able to protect others or even himself, and that's the last thing Ichigo wants. The Lost Agent arc shows us the consequences of this outcome. Ichigo was always waiting to return to a quiet, normal life. But as soon as he gets his normal, uneventful life, he starts missing the old one. Everyone is now protecting him from behind his back. His friends have taken over Hollow duty and the other Soul Reapers are fighting unseen battles. Battles Ichigo wouldn't be able to see even if they were happening right in front of his face. Many of them working behind his back specifically to repay him, to give him a chance at normalcy. Helplessness is probably Ichigo's least favorite emotion, and while he won't feel it as dramatically as when Rukia was taken or when he lost to Aizen, he now feels it in a constant melancholy. He jumps at any mundane problem as he's always done, but knowing that he's useless against greater dangers is saddening. It's no wonder he jumped at the chance to gain power again, to protect his friends once more or to get a chance to see Rukia and Renji again. Having to live in a world without hollows created distance between himself and his friends. Since the beginning, Ichigo's world has constantly been expanding as he explored more and more of Bleach's cosmology and the people in it. But Lost Agent is the only arc where Ichigo's world shrinks. And it's this setup that allowed the subject of today's video to take advantage of Ichigo. But before we begin talking about Ginjo, let's yap about Bleach's lore for a bit. The funny thing about Bleach's power system is that even if many abilities create the same outcome, like a big laser attack, every faction in Bleach draws from a different source of power. Like every group has a slightly different way of moving very fast and pulling a teleports behind you, when they could have just left no explanation and we as readers could just assume that guys are fast. But the sword decided to get nerdy about it. It's all reishi at the end of the day, but how each group gets it and utilizes it is where it becomes interesting. Quincy's and Hollows use external sources of power. Quincy's can absorb reishi in the environment and even reishi in other people. Some of the greatest of Quincy abilities involve stealing powers such as stealing Bankai, or sharing and recovering power from others like Yuobak. These manifest in some very specific ways, like how Bambi doesn't shoot bombs, she turns whatever touches her reishi into a bomb. Hollows and Arrancar consume other souls to grow stronger. The more they eat, the more they evolve, the stronger they become. They're very simple. Shinigami use Zanpakuto to draw from their inner strength. What sets them apart most is how they use internal sources of power. They don't go out collecting reishi or eating souls to grow stronger. They rely on the power of their own soul, in the form of a sword. They rely most on training and self-reflection to grow stronger. This is also why Ichigo never fully loses the potential to become a Soul Reaper again, even after Ginjo steals more power from him. The core of a Soul Reaper's powers are inseparable from the self. And lastly, fullbringers are attachments to earthly possessions. Fullbringers cannot pull reishi out of objects like Quincy's or consume it like Hollows. They have to manipulate the reishi in physical objects to then control those objects. With their greatest powers coming from objects they have the greatest attachments to. As the group that naturally exists in the world of the living, I think their powers represent earthly desires and attachments to material things. Fullbring powers are described as being closer to a Hollows than a Soul Reapers, and while some explanation we receive later on might contradict that, it's true in the sense that Fullbringers all feel empty or yearning inside, and fill that void with material objects. Ririka wanted to love and be loved, but never managed to develop proper relationships, so she pours her love into cute objects instead. Yukio didn't have a good home life, so used his Fullbring and gaming as an escape. Jackie's boots are the only memento from her dead family, her father in particular. Yuriko low-key appears to be a sociopath, willing to kill his own wife just to test the limits of his prized stopwatch. Tsukishima was alone at a young age, and now he inserts himself into the histories of others, stealing their affection. And lastly, Aura from the Can't Fear Your Own World novel was isolated from the world at a very young age, and as a result she gained no attachments to anything. A Fullbringer unable to express love or interest resulted in a Fullbringer without a specialized object, but one who excelled at the base abilities of a Fullbringer to manipulate all inanimate objects. Of all the characters in the franchise, I'd argue she's the most similar to Ulquiorra. Her character arc is even about learning to care for someone else, which helps drives home the point that they all feel empty inside, quite like Hollows. The fact that they are all unlike most humans further isolated them. They have the opposite problem Ichigo has, but the symptoms are the same. Feelings of isolation and helplessness due to a gap in strength to those around them. As I'm sure we all understand, the heart is the coolest thing in Bleach, and a heart is supposed to exist between two people. Keeping Kaien's dialogue in mind, it's not a stretch to say Fullbringers put their heart into these objects. Every fullbring item is either a sentimental object that represents a lost bond like Ichigo's deputy badge, Ginjo's watch, and Jackie's boots, or something to subsidize bonds that never were, like Yukio's console or Ryuka's dollhouse. While we don't know the exact origin of Tsukishima's bookmark, I'm guessing it's both that books were a hobby of escapism similar to Yukio's gaming, and his power creates artificial bonds between himself and others. This is even consistent with Chad and Orihime. Chad's arm of the giant is tied to his abuelo, and Orihime's hairpin is a memento from her brother. Grief has always been one of the major themes in Bleach, so this consistency isn't surprising. This is partly why I think the hollow comparison makes so much sense. Every fullbringer is plagued with loneliness in some way. To explain Ginjo's emptiness, I'd like to dissect his volume poem. Time always approaches from behind, growling and flowing past our eyes. Stand your ground. No matter how much time shows its fangs, in order to wash you away to a beautiful past. Do not look forward. Your hopes creep up behind you, only existing in dark, turbid waters. Ginjo's poem is about not letting your sentimentality distract you. Time always approaches from behind because we cannot see our future. It's only the nostalgic past that can blind us and tempt us to return to a beautiful past. This expresses Ginjo's attempts to manipulate Ichigo by offering his old life back, while he himself is trying to create distance from his past as a Soul Reaper. This arc also takes place when Ichigo and his classmates start thinking about graduation, when a teenager's future looks the most unclear. It's one of the many details that sets a good foundation for Yurobak as the final villain, as fearing the future will be a much bigger theme next arc. This poem also foreshadows Tsukishima's abilities, who is Ginjo's closest ally and whose power revolves around manipulating the past. Also, the line, "Your hopes creep up behind you, only existing in dark turbid waters," illustrates how Ginjo describes hope as a bad thing. You cannot trust hope. You can only trust yourself. People will stab you in the back and betray you. But as it turns out, Ichigo is almost literally stabbed in the back by hope right before the climax of the arc. But despite this, Ginjo managed to trust Tsukishima enough to erase his memories for the sake of deceiving Ichigo, which ironically is more trust than Ichigo gave any of his friends or family this arc. Had he just talked to his dad right here, the plot could have been resolved pretty quickly. Ginjo saw a gap forming between Ichigo and his friends, and then used his offers to drive a wedge in them, and then almost broke them down entirely with the help of Tsukishima. And let's take a minute to appreciate how Tsukishima arguably pushed Ichigo emotionally more than any other villain in the series. Part of the reason Ichigo was so tenacious is because he always had a normal life waiting for him to return to, after dealing with the life-threatening and world-ending shenanigans. And for the first time, someone is intentionally targeting that life. His place of rest and normalcy is compromised, and it disturbs him to the point he seriously considers killing another human for the first time. It was also a fun way to set up one of the best twists in the story. It's always nice when a twist villain has good subtle build-up. A lot of Ginjo's lies work well because on a first read, you'd be unsure how much of his dishonesty is intentional and how much is due to Tsukishima's ability. While it's not hard to guess Ginjo would become a villain, a lot of his dialogue becomes more meaningful on reread. My favorite instance is probably when he says, "Your deputy badge remembers." What was once just a simple comment on Ichigo's fullbring now reflects his true feelings. Though he is no longer a substitute Soul Reaper, Ginjo still has memories and experiences engraved into his own body, and the proof of that is that his deputy badge is one of his fullbrings. Although it didn't do Ginjo any good at the time, he, like Ichigo, did change the laws of Soul Society somewhat. The substitute law was made just for Ginjo, and that law set a precedent for Ichigo to establish a formal relationship with the Gote 13, and to work closely with them in the Arrancar saga. In his death, Ginjo ponders if the order of them becoming deputies changed, would their roles be reversed too? And that may very well be the case. Ginjo is without a doubt the most on-the-nose Ichigo parallel in the whole manga. He, like many great villains, is a bad-end version of the protagonist. They are the only substitute Soul Reapers, both have hollow powers, both struggle with trust throughout the arc, and Ginjo's cross of scaffold even carries a similar ability to Zangetsu, a simple but powerful sword slash. Let's talk about that sword for a minute, because there is a boatload of interesting implications in this thing. Ginjo is capable of using Bankai. It's ambiguous whether it's his own or an iteration of Ichigo's. Uryu said that Ginjo using Getsuga Tensho likely means he can use some of Ichigo's other abilities, so he may have copied his Bankai powers too. The shape of the grip does look like the blade of Ichigo's Bankai, but Ginjo doesn't get a black coat but instead white hair and wings, and the guard doesn't take on a manji shape but instead changes from a normal guard to what looks like a pair of horns. So it seems like this is Ginjo's Bankai with a bit of Ichigo's mixed in, because there are elements that belong neither to Ichigo's Bankai or the original cross of scaffold. The power of his Bankai only slightly changes the shape of his sword, but that's probably because it already reflected the Bankai's power as well. The most apparent change after Ginjo transforms is he looks more like a hollow and he can now use Seros. And his sword has a hollow center for another grip, just like how hollows have holes in their bodies. This is another similarity it has with Ichigo's current Bankai and with a later version of Zangetsu. This next bit is a bit of a stretch, but one thing that distinguishes Ginjo's hole from Ichigo's is that it allows for a second handle, making it easier for Ginjo to attack people closer to him. Get it? He has trust issues and he doesn't want people getting close to him. Because hollows are the source of fullbring powers, the story draws parallels between the two groups as I mentioned before. So it seems like this Bankai is Ginjo's attempt to combine his Shinigami, hollow, and fullbring powers into one, which actually kind of resembles Ichigo's final form in the Thousand Year Blood War. And because the Cross's scaffold always had this hole, it's not here just because he stole Ichigo's powers. They always shared the similarity. Another good detail is all the X's in his design, relating to the name of his sword, the name of his group Execution, and the X on his Soul Reaper badge. Which, as I remind you, is combined with the Cross's scaffold right now. He has 2 fullbrings. Seeing how Ginjo can still use Bankai, he must still have his Soul Reaper powers. But that begs the question of whether or not the Cross of Scaffold is a Zanpakuto, or just a fullbring. I'm convinced it's the former. I have no idea whether the Cross of Scaffold is its true name or not, or why we never heard the name of his Bankai, which I think is a missed opportunity. But it might point to something interesting I missed. Wielding a Bankai without its matching Zanpakuto is unheard of, outside of the Quincy stealing them. Zanpakuto can begin as their own separate items as Asachis, so it's easy to imagine Ginjo using his own fullbring powers to disguise it as a pendant. But underneath that disguise is the truth that Ginjo's pride is in his tools as a Soul Reaper. Even if I'm wrong and that's not his Zanpakuto, his deputy badge is his second fullbring. The substitute badge to him represents the distrust and bad blood between him and the Soul Reapers, but it looks like acting as a Soul Reaper, helping people, exercising souls, and becoming stronger are things he took pride in. He most definitely enjoyed being a Soul Reaper, enough to take pride in his badge, enough to make it his fullbring. In total, Ginjo has the following abilities: his fullbring powers alongside the fullbring he took from Ichigo, his own Soul Reaper powers, and small remnants of hollow powers brought out by his Bankai. Excluding his remnants and Yuobak, Ichigo and Ginjo are the 2 beings closest to the Soul King. The novels even mention that, if need be, Ichigo could possibly replace the Soul King, and if not him, Ginjo is the next best bet. The only part Ichigo has that Ginjo is missing is Quincy powers. I've seen some people theorize that Ginjo is a Quincy due to all of his cross imagery. I disagree because firstly, these crosses all clearly relate to his X motif, but also I think that if this is the case, it would have been brought up in the Blood War. Yuobak took special interest in Uryu because he survived the Purge, and if Ginjo was a Quincy, presumably he'd have done the same. Or Uryu and his dad would have noticed. They go out of the way to say they never felt pressure like Ginjo and Tsukishima's before. So it'd be weird if they didn't pick up any Quincy reishi there. Although I doubt he's physically related to the Quincy's, at the very least he kind of acts like one in a few particular ways. He took powers from Ichigo and split it amongst his followers, and he's even exchanged a bit of power with some of the fullbringers before the arc began, which is a lot like how Yuobak used his powers. So at the very least, Ginjo has a couple similarities with Yuobak. The details of Ginjo's crimes are unknown, but despite killing a bunch of Soul Reapers, Ginjo didn't go to hell, which is very interesting. I can think of 3 possible explanations. We don't know any specifics about how hell judges souls, at least not yet. Give us another hell arc, Kubo, please. So all or none of my ideas could be true. Firstly, his retaliation against the Soul Reapers may have been somewhat justified. I don't want to spoil the novels because they're good, but Can't Fear Your Own World gives more context to Ginjo's backstory. It makes his actions more justified in retrospect. And even within the manga, we're given reason to doubt the integrity of some of the Soul Reapers. So even if revenge was Ginjo's primary motivation, at least it stems from an injustice. Secondly, it's possible Hell doesn't care much for crimes against Soul Reapers, which could be a very interesting thing to explore in the Hell arc, although it's possible that if his plans came to fruition, he'd have sinned enough to go to Hell. And lastly, Ginjo may have been too genuinely kind to go to Hell. When he didn't have his memories, he was willing to suffer to help Ichigo unlock his fullbring, and he likely did the same for Tsukishima and possibly other members of Execution. A large part of Ginjo's motivation was to help the other fullbringers, either by removing their powers or giving them a place to belong in Execution. Unlike Shinigami and Hollows, who have a whole society and realm to rule, the fullbringers are incredibly few in number. In fact, they're the rarest type of being in Bleach. And unlike the Quincy, fullbring powers aren't genetically passed down, so they can't build a family or clan. There are less than a dozen fullbringers in the entire franchise. and they only found one another because Ginjo sought them out and gathered them. It's so natural for Ginjo, who lost his place in the human world and Soul Society, to ease his own loneliness by seeking out the few humans who could understand him. He was a murderer to Soul Society, but also a hero to the fullbringers. Ichigo never forgave Ginjo, but he did come to understand him, and that in a small way saved Ginjo. Maybe being able to see a Deputy Soul Reaper change Soul Society and gain mutual trust with them was enough to ease his vendetta and give him peace of mind before passing on. Ichigo taking Ginjo's body back to the world of the living for proper burial, a final act of respect. And it's probably the most Soul Reaper-like thing to do. Their job is to aid the dead in their transition to the next life, so this is the least anyone should get, regardless of whether Ichigo personally likes them or hates them. It's been said 1,000 times in hundreds of places, but Lost Agent is an incredibly underrated arc. Short, sweet, filled with good gags and interesting concepts and characters. My favorite of which is this guy right here, the Lost Agent of Bleach. Thank you for watching. Part of me wondered whether or not to include some of the stuff in my big Bankai video. I ended up skimming over Ginjo because talking about his character meant I would have to talk about fullbringers, and the details of his Bankai are murkier than most anyways. So a video more focused on the fullbringer arc felt more appropriate here. Again, thank you for watching. I want to do more Bleach content, but I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do next. Probably something with the Blood War, so expect that in like 5 or 6 months when I finally make up my mind. Goodbye.